Hey, it's Connor from the Steel Lodge, and today we're checking out the Dead Space series, the first three games created by Visceral. And I want to check these out on the Steam Deck because in 2022 and 2023, we're going to get a lot of survival horror games. Callisto Protocol, which is actually developed by a lot of the same devs that worked on these Dead Space games, the remake of the original Dead Space game, and even things like the Resident Evil 4 remake, which Dead Space is very heavily inspired by. Now, these games were originally created for the Xbox 360 and PS3 era, so I put them around middle school, and I actually only played Dead Space 1 and 2. I don't think I beat either of them back in the day. 3 I heard bad things about, so I never got around to playing it, but I know my friends and I were really interested in these games and definitely enjoyed playing them when they came out. For us, they were definitely some of the scariest games we had played at the time, so I wanted to revisit them now, and the Steam Deck crushes these games pretty easily, but I just wanted to see how they play on here and if there's anything we need to know. With that being said, let's jump into the performance here for each of the games. First up here, we're looking at Dead Space. Now this one is verified for the Steam Deck, so you basically just install it and you're good to go. With some of the other games, there's a little bit more setup process involved. Here it's very straightforward. Graphics wise, I have all the settings maxed out here, but don't use the in-game VSync because that will limit the game to 30 FPS, so just use the Steam Deck's capped one if you need to. Some things to note about Dead Space 1 is that this game doesn't have texture filtering. You can do this on PC if you go into your NVIDIA control panel, or I'm sure your AMD one, and you can manually force it there. The same goes with SSAO. It doesn't have it here in the game settings. On the Steam Deck here, I don't have access to those driver menus though, so SSAO and texture filtering are missing. So textures at a distance and at certain angles are going to look degraded. Things also won't have as much depth because SSAO is missing here. Now, as far as performance is concerned here, 60 FPS is easily attainable on the Steam Deck, and it's very consistent at that. And as far as battery life goes, I had just under 90% here, giving me just shy of 5 hours of playtime. Now this is on an external display, so on the go it will be a little bit lower than this, but it's still a lot of playtime for a game running at 60 FPS here. So since this game is pretty easy to run, I was curious what kind of maximum battery life I could get here if I really locked things down. So I've locked the frame rate to 40 FPS, and additionally I've dropped the TDP of the Steam Deck all the way down to 3 watts, which is as low as you can limit it to with the in-menu settings. Doing this gave me a very consistent 40 FPS, and I think the original Dead Space plays very well at that frame rate. If you want to, maybe bump it up 1 more watt just to make sure it's very consistent, but I didn't really have any problems here. Overall, battery life savings wise, I got about 30 to 40 more minutes using these settings, so if you have a full charge, you can really play this one for an extremely long time using these settings. The original Dead Space is probably the entry I've spent the most time with. I remember when my friend got this back in the day, me and my other friends were like, oh my god, what is this game? I've never heard of it before. And then we checked it out with him and thought it was super cool. So I ended up renting it from Blockbuster and playing it a bit on my own too, but I don't think I ever got to the end of the game, even though the game's not that long. The only other game I'd really played like this in the survival horror genre was Resident Evil 4 on the Wii, and I love that Wii version of that game. But let's jump over to Dead Space 2 now. The first time you fire up Dead Space 2 on the Steam Deck, it's going to prompt you to enter in the CD key for the game. If you played games back in the day, you remember your games coming with these physically, or even on Steam, you used to get these more often. But this is pretty straightforward to find. If you go to your Steam account on your desktop and just hit Properties and look for the CD key for the game, you can find it on there and just enter it right into the Steam Deck, which is what I did here. I don't know if you can look it up right on your Steam Deck itself, but on my computer, I just pulled that up pretty quick. One thing you're going to have to do, though, is use your touchscreen to click on the entry field, or you're going to have to change your input for your trackpad to be a mouse so you can click on the field, and then you'll have to use the Steam button and X key to pull up your keyboard to manually enter in the key code here. Once again, here we're using the maximum in-game settings, but VSync for the in-game is turned off, and I'm using the Steam Deck settings to cap the frame rate here. If you use the in-game one, it will cap the game to 30 FPS, which we don't want. Additionally, this entry also does not have texture filtering or SSAO, which can be forced using driver panels on desktops, but here I don't have that enabled. Performance-wise, once again, we're hitting 60 FPS extremely consistently, and doing so without using that much power, which means we get a great battery life here at 60 FPS on the go. With a 75% battery charge, I'm getting around 3.5 hours of playtime here, but I am on an external monitor, so on the go, you might get a little bit less battery life than this, but overall, this is a super good playtime for a game like this playing at 60 FPS. Now, once again, trying to optimize for battery life, I've locked it down to 40 FPS. This time I did have to creep the TDP up to 4 watts to get a consistent frame rate, but our battery life is 5% lower here, and we're getting around the same amount of playtime, so this is definitely going to help you out on the long run if you want to maximize your playtime. The battery savings here are nice, and playing at 40 FPS feels just fine, but honestly, the battery savings aren't super necessary because you're already getting really good battery life at 60 FPS, so unless your Steam Deck's about to die or you can't charge it anytime soon, I don't think you really need to play in this way. I really enjoyed Dead Space 2, and actually replaying the start of this game, it really made me appreciate how fast the game gets you to the core mechanics of the game, with the stasis and telekinesis. It does feel a little bit faster paced than the first game, but I don't think it's too action focused or anything. It's just the right blend. I'm pretty interested to see what EA is going to do if the Dead Space remake sells really well, if they'll actually move on to Dead Space 2 and remake that game exactly how it was remade in the first place, or what they'll do after that, because obviously Dead Space 3 is not as well received, so maybe the remake succeeds, they'll remake 2 and then try to tell a different story than what we saw in 3. But speaking of 3, let's jump on over to that one. So when you fire up Dead Space 3 for the first time, it's going to make you install Origin. This will just install it to the games directory, so it's not really a problem. The setup's a little bit of a hassle though, because I did remap my trackpad to be a mouse, but it wasn't working, so I'd use the touchscreen to click on it. Not really a problem if you're on the go, but on an external monitor, the mapping for the touchscreen is a little bit weird, so it was slightly annoying. Now, once Origin was set up and installed for the first time, I just went ahead and skipped signing into it. You can sign into Origin if you want to sync it to your Origin account, but I didn't really care for that right now. Now, once Origin is set up, I never really had to mess with it again for the following times I played the game on the Steam Deck, so that's good to know. Now, one thing I was pretty surprised by is that Dead Space 3 is ranked as playable for the Steam Deck, but the controls for this game didn't work as controller inputs. I actually had to go and use the community setup here, which maps the inputs for the Steam Deck to controller inputs, so it'll act like an Xbox 360 controller, the layout of that normally would. I found this to be really strange, and I even tried different versions of Proton to see if that was the problem, but it wasn't. But honestly, the community layout here actually worked really well. It's just strange that the other two games worked, and for this one, even on the in-game settings menu, it didn't detect a controller at all. One nice thing about Dead Space 3 though is that they enhanced the graphical options here, giving us SSAO and texture filtering in the in-game options menu, which will make the game look quite a bit better than the previous two entries. Once again though, leave your VSync in-game settings to off, because if you turn it on, it will limit the game to 30 FPS, so use the Steam Deck's frame rate cap option. Now, these enhanced graphical settings don't come for free, and the battery life performance for Dead Space 3 is lower than the other games, but once again here, we can hit 60 FPS pretty consistently. Our GPU is definitely working harder here with those extra graphical options that we enabled, but also here, if we look at our CPU, one of the threads is running around 70%, and that's definitely going to chew up some more battery life, versus the other games where the CPU performance was generally a lot lower. Now, with the game running at 60 FPS and max setting, without any TDP limit, we're getting around 3 hours of performance at 77% battery life, which is okay still, but not the best compared to the last two games. In order to get some battery life back, I locked the game to 40 FPS and lowered the TDP to around 6 watts. This gave me a pretty consistent frame time overall, and definitely gave me a lot more battery life as opposed to the previous settings with no TDP limit and running at 60 FPS. Dead Space 3 is definitely the most action-focused game here, and it's the one that benefits the most from locking the frame rate down for battery life savings. Now, this was actually my first time ever playing Dead Space 3. Back in the day, I saw the negative fan reception to the game, and the critic score was a bit lower, so I stayed away from it. And playing it now, I can definitely see the difference here. The beginning of the game is just totally action-packed, and it's almost like Uncharted with some of the set pieces that happen there. And even some of these sequences here where you're fighting humans, it's trying to be like a cover shooter with no cover-based mechanics. It definitely feels very far away from what the franchise wanted to be at its core, and I wouldn't be surprised if games like Gears of War and Call of Duty really made EA want to push the studio to be more action-oriented to draw more customers in. This game does have co-op mode, which I've never played before, but I'd expect that to be the most fun way to play this game. With the Callisto Protocol landing later this year and Dead Space Remake coming out next year, it's a great time to replay these games, and the Steam Deck is a great place to do it. You can be nice and cozy in your bed with all the lights out, snuggled up with some Dead Space, ready to get some nightmare fuel right before you pass out. But that's going to wrap it up here for this video, guys. If you want more survival horror games on the Steam Deck, consider checking out my channel. I've covered all the Resident Evil games basically on the Steam Deck and how to mod a couple of them and how they look. Other than that, if you liked the video, give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel. Thanks everybody and have a good one.